The conversation died mid-sentence. An elderly man in a faded Marine Corps cap steadied himself against the table as the owner's voice cut through the dining room like a blade. "This isn't a charity case, old man. Pay up or get out." Humiliation painted the veteran's weathered face crimson. Then came the sound, low at first, then unmistakable. The rumble of motorcycles. Not just a few, dozens. The leather-clad figures at the corner tables were already rising, and through the window, chrome and steel filled the parking lot like an arriving storm. 100 Hell's Angels had just pulled up, and they'd heard every word. "Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." The Oakwood Bistro sat on the edge of Riverside Bluff, Oregon, where the Columbia River carved through pine-covered hills. It wasn't much to look at. Weathered brick exterior, a neon sign that buzzed and flickered, windows that hadn't been properly cleaned in months. But it was the only restaurant that stayed open past 9 o'clock, and on cold October evenings. It drew everyone from truckers to families finishing weekend road trips. Eugene Caldwell, Gene to anyone who knew him, pushed through the heavy glass door just after 8:30. At 81 years old, every step was deliberate. His right knee, shattered by shrapnel in Da Nang, had never healed right despite 3 surgeries. The cane in his left hand wasn't for show. It was survival. He wore his Marine Corps cap, the eagle, globe, and anchor emblem faded but still visible. His windbreaker hung loose on his frame. He'd lost weight over the years, the kind of weight that comes from skipped meals and stretching social security checks too thin. Beneath the jacket, his flannel shirt was clean but worn, buttons mismatched from years of replacement repairs he'd done himself. Gene had served 2 tours in Vietnam. He'd carried wounded men through rice paddies under fire. He'd written letters home for brothers who couldn't read or write. He'd earned a Purple Heart and a Bronze Star, both tucked away in a shoebox under his bed because displaying them felt like bragging. And Gene had never been that kind of man. But the America he'd returned to hadn't rolled out any red carpets. The VA appointments were endless. The disability checks barely covered rent. Jobs dried up when employers saw the limp, heard about the nightmares, noticed the tremor in his hands on cold mornings. He'd worked as a night janitor for 15 years until his body couldn't handle it anymore. Now he lived alone in a 1-bedroom apartment above a laundromat, where the smell of detergent seeped through the floorboards and the radiator clanked like artillery fire. Tonight, Gene just wanted soup and coffee, maybe a piece of pie if he could afford it, something warm to chase away the autumn chill that had settled into his bones. The bistro hummed with quiet activity. A family occupied a booth near the window, father scrolling through his phone, mother cutting up chicken tenders for a restless toddler. 2 truckers sat at the counter, discussing routes and fuel prices. In the far corner, partially obscured by shadow, a group of men sat in silence. Leather vests, thick beards, the unmistakable presence of bikers. Gene didn't pay them much attention. He'd seen plenty of motorcycle clubs over the years. Some rough, some decent, all keeping to themselves. He shuffled toward an empty booth near the kitchen, his cane tapping against the scuffed linoleum. A young waitress, Meredith, her name tag read, approached with a tired but genuine smile. She couldn't have been more than 25, with auburn hair pulled into a messy bun and dark circles under her eyes that spoke of double shifts and unpaid bills. "Evening, sir. What can I get you?" Gene's voice came out raspy, worn from decades of cigarettes he'd quit 10 years too late. "Just the chicken noodle soup and black coffee, please. And if it's not too much trouble, a glass of water." Meredith nodded, scribbling on her pad. Coming right up, she disappeared into the kitchen, and Gene allowed himself a moment to relax. The booth's vinyl was cracked and patched with duct tape, but it was warm. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Somewhere in the back, a radio played classic rock at low volume. For a brief moment, Gene felt almost normal, almost like he belonged. That's when Mr. Brennan appeared. The owner of the Oakwood Bistro was a man in his mid-50s with slicked back hair that glistened with too much pomade. His dress shirt was starched within an inch of its life, collar tight enough to redden his neck. He carried himself with the air of someone who'd never been told no, never been challenged, never had to fight for anything beyond profit margins. Brennan's eyes swept over Jean with the kind of assessment reserved for stray dogs and broken furniture. He noted the worn jacket, the trembling hands, the cane propped against the booth. His lip curled. "Excuse me," Brennan said, his tone flat and cold. "You planning to pay for that meal?" Jean looked up, confused. "Yes, sir. I ordered soup and coffee. I asked if you can pay." Brennan folded his arms across his chest. "Because we've had problems with drifters coming in here ordering food, then claiming they don't have money. I run a business, not a soup kitchen." Heat crawled up Jean's neck. Around them, conversations faltered. The mother at the family booth glanced over nervously. One of the truckers paused mid-bite. "I have money," Jean said quietly, reaching into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a worn leather wallet, opening it to reveal a $20 bill and a few ones. "See, I can pay." Brennan's sneer deepened. "That's supposed to impress me? You come in here looking like something the cat dragged in, and I'm supposed to believe you're good for it." Jean's hands trembled, not from age now, but from humiliation. "I'm a veteran, sir. United States Marine Corps. I just wanted a warm meal." "Veteran," Brennan snorted. "You know how many people use that line? Flash an old hat, expect free handouts. Well, not in my establishment." He leaned closer, voice dropping to a harsh whisper that still carried across the quiet room. "We don't serve beggars here. This isn't a charity case. You want food? Go to a shelter." Jean's vision blurred. Shame, hot and suffocating, pressed down on his chest. This wasn't the first time. There had been the grocery store manager who'd followed him through the aisles, assuming he'd shoplift. The bank teller who'd spoken to him like a child when he'd struggled to fill out a form with his shaking hands. The landlord who'd called him a charity case when he'd asked for 2 extra days to make rent. But this, being called a beggar in front of strangers, having his service dismissed like a con artist's lie, this cut deeper than shrapnel ever had. "I can pay," Jean repeated, his voice barely a whisper now. "Please, I just want soup." Brennan straightened, his decision made. "I want you out, now." Meredith appeared from the kitchen, carrying a bowl of steaming soup and a coffee mug. Her eyes widened as she took in the scene. "Mr. Brennan, I already took his order." "Cancel it," Brennan snapped. "He's leaving." Jean tried to stand, his movements slow and painful. His cane slipped on the tile, clattering to the floor with a sharp crack that echoed through the bistro. A teenager at a nearby table snickered behind his hand. The old Marine bent down, reaching for the cane, his bad knee screaming in protest. His fingers brushed the handle, but shame made his movements clumsy. He felt every eye in the room on him, judging, pitying, dismissing, and that's when the sound began. Low at first. A distant rumble like thunder rolling in from the coast, then louder. Chairs scraped. Boots hit the floor in unison. The men in the corner booth, the bikers Jean had barely noticed, rose as one. Leather creaked. Patches caught the light. The Hells Angels emblem gleamed on their vests. But they weren't the only ones. Through the bistro's windows, headlights appeared. 1, 5, 20, 50. The parking lot flooded with motorcycles. Chrome catching the streetlights like a river of steel. Engines cut off in sequence, and the silence that followed was somehow louder than the rumble had been. The door opened, and they kept coming. One by one, Hell's Angels filed into the Oakwood Bistro. They filled the entryway, lined the walls, stood shoulder to shoulder until there was no space left. Leather and denim, grey beards and tattooed arms. Men who'd seen their own battles, fought their own wars, carried their own scars. 100 strong, and every single one of them was staring at Mr. Brennan. The temperature in the Oakwood Bistro seemed to drop 10 degrees. Mr. Brennan's face, flushed with arrogance moments before, drained to the color of old newspaper. His eyes darted from one leather-clad figure to another, searching for an exit that didn't exist. Jean remained, bent over his fallen cane, frozen in place. His fingers finally closed around the handle, but he couldn't bring himself to stand. The weight of 100 stares, though none directed at him, pressed down like a physical force. From the group that had been sitting in the corner booth, a man stepped forward. He moved with the deliberate calm of someone who'd never needed to rush, never needed to prove anything. His leather vest bore the distinctive winged skull patch of the Hells Angels, and stitched across the front in faded white letters was a single word: Axel. He was somewhere in his 60s, with a grey beard braided down to his chest and arms covered in ink that told stories of roads travelled and brothers lost. A scar ran from his left eyebrow to his cheekbone, the kind of mark that came from glass and asphalt, not a surgeon's careful hand. His eyes, though, were what held the room. They were the blue-grey of winter sky, and they missed nothing. Axel walked past Jean without a word, stopping directly in front of Brennan. The owner tried to stand taller, tried to summon the authority he'd wielded so freely moments ago, but his voice came out thin and uncertain. "This is private property. You can't what?" Axel's voice was quiet, almost conversational. "That made it more dangerous. Can't walk into a public restaurant." "Pretty sure that door says open." Brennan's hands fidgeted at his sides. Behind him, Meredith had backed against the wall, still holding Jean's soup and coffee. The family in the booth near the window gathered their child quickly, the father dropping cash on the table as they headed for the door. The bikers parted wordlessly to let them pass. "I run a business here," Brennan stammered. "I have the right to refuse service." "To refuse service," Axel interrupted, his tone still eerily calm. "Or to humiliate a man who served his country while you were probably still in diapers?" One of the younger bikers, a massive man with a shaved head and a neck like a tree trunk, crossed his arms and spoke up. "We heard every word, man. Every single word." Another voice came from near the door, this one belonging to a woman in her 50s, with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a tight ponytail. Her vest bore as many patches as any of the men. "Called him a beggar, a charity case. Told a Marine to go to a shelter." Brennan's face reddened, but whether from shame or anger it was impossible to tell. "I didn't know he was, anyone can wear a hat." "Stop talking." Axel's words cut through the excuse like a knife. "You didn't ask. You didn't care. You saw an old man with a cane and worn clothes, and you decided he wasn't worth your time. Wasn't worth basic human decency." Behind them, Jean finally managed to stand, using his cane for support. His legs felt weak, his heart hammering in his chest. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He'd come in for soup, not to cause trouble, not to bring down the wrath of 100 bikers on some small-town restaurant owner. "Please," Jean said, his voice cracking. "I don't want any trouble. I'll just go." Axel turned, and for the first time his expression softened. "You're not going anywhere, brother." "Not like this." The word brother hit Jean like a physical blow. When was the last time someone had called him that? When was the last time anyone had stood up for him instead of stepping over him? Axel looked back at Brennan. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to apologize to this man. A real apology. Not some corporate sorry you feel that way garbage. A genuine, from-the-heart recognition that you were wrong." Brennan's jaw clenched. "I don't have to—" The rumble started low, a collective growl from 100 throats that didn't need words to convey a message. It was the sound of patience running out, of men who'd seen too much injustice to let one more slide. Meredith, still pressed against the wall, spoke up quietly. "Mr. Brennan, maybe you should just— he's just an old man who wanted soup." 81, Jean said suddenly, his voice stronger now. "I'm 81 years old. I served 2 tours in Vietnam. I carried wounded men through jungle under enemy fire. I watched friends die in my arms. I came home to a country that spit on my uniform and called me a baby killer." His hand tightened on his cane. "I've been poor. I've been homeless. I've been hungry. But I have never in all my years been a beggar." The silence that followed was absolute. Even Brennan seemed shaken, his earlier bravado crumbling like wet paper. Jean continued, his voice wavering but determined. "I have $23 in my wallet. I was going to spend 7 of it on soup and coffee. I was going to tip this young lady $3 because she smiled at me like I was human. And I was going to walk home and go to bed with something warm in my stomach for the first time in 3 days. Meredith's eyes filled with tears. One of the bikers near the counter swore softly and looked away. Axel's voice, when he spoke again, was steel wrapped in velvet. "You hear that, Brennan? 3 days. This Marine went 3 days without a hot meal. And when he came to your establishment, your business, as you keep calling it, you treated him like trash." Brennan's mouth opened and closed, like a fish out of water. Around the bistro, the other patrons who'd remained, the 2 truckers, an elderly couple in a back booth, watched in silence. This wasn't just about one old man anymore. This was about every person who'd ever been judged by their appearance, dismissed because they didn't fit someone's idea of acceptable. Brennan started, then stopped. His eyes swept across the room, taking in the sea of leather and weathered faces. These weren't young punks looking for a fight. These were men and women who'd lived hard lives, who knew what it meant to be on the outside, who recognized one of their own when they saw him. "I made a mistake," Brennan finally said. But his tone was sullen, obligatory, not good enough. This came from a biker near the window. A man with grey hair, pulled back in a ponytail and reading glasses, hanging from a chain around his neck. "You don't apologize to us. You apologize to him." All eyes turned to Jean. The old Marine stood straighter than he had in years, his chin lifted, his cane planted firmly on the ground. For decades, he'd made himself small, accepting scraps, taking insults, shrinking into the background because it was easier than fighting, because he was tired, because no one cared. But standing there, surrounded by 100 strangers who'd stopped their evening to defend him, something shifted. An ember of pride, long buried under years of shame and poverty, began to glow. Brennan turned to face Jean fully. I apologize. I was wrong to speak to you that way." "Why were you wrong?" Axel pressed. "Say it," Brennan swallowed hard. "Because you served our country. Because you deserve respect. Because he's a human being," Axel corrected coldly. "The uniform matters. But it shouldn't take a uniform for someone to be treated with basic dignity." Jean felt something wet on his cheek and realized he was crying. Not from sadness, but from something he couldn't quite name. Relief, vindication, the simple, overwhelming feeling of being seen. Meredith stepped forward tentatively, still holding the bowl of soup. "Sir, would you like to sit down? The meal's on the house. And please, take your time." Jean nodded, not trusting his voice. Axel gestured to the booth Jean had originally chosen, and 2 bikers, who'd been standing nearby, stepped back to give him space. As Jean lowered himself carefully onto the cracked vinyl, every movement painful but dignified, Meredith set the soup and coffee in front of him with trembling hands. "Thank you," Jean whispered. She squeezed his shoulder gently. "Thank you, sir, for your service, for everything." The bikers began to disperse slightly, no longer blocking every inch of floor space, but maintaining a presence. A message was being sent, and it was clear this man was under protection now. Jean lifted the spoon to his lips with a hand that still trembled, but for different reasons now. The soup was simple, chicken, noodles, carrots, celery, but it tasted like the finest meal he'd ever eaten. Maybe because it came with something he hadn't experienced in years. Dignity. Axel slid into the booth across from him without asking permission. Up close, Jean could see the details he'd missed before. The small silver cross hanging from a leather cord around the biker's neck. The laugh lines around his eyes that suggested this man knew joy as well as hardship. The way his weathered hands bore scars that told their own stories. "Name's Axel," the biker said. Extending his hand, Jean set down his spoon and shook it. The grip was firm but not crushing, respectful. "Eugene Caldwell. Most people call me Jean." "Jean," Axel nodded. "Marine Corps, you said. What unit?" "1st Battalion, 3rd Marines. We called ourselves the Thundering Third." Jean's voice grew steadier as he spoke about something familiar, something that still mattered. "Did my first tour in 66, second in 68. Axel's eyes held recognition. "Tet Offensive. Yeah." Jean didn't elaborate. Some memories didn't need words. Around them, the other bikers had settled into a routine. Some took seats at empty tables. Others stood near the windows, arms crossed, keeping watch. A few had gone outside, but their motorcycles remained a steel barrier in the parking lot. The message was clear. They weren't leaving until Jean did. Meredith moved between tables, her earlier nervousness replaced by something like awe. She refilled coffee cups without being asked, her eyes occasionally drifting to Jean, as if trying to memorize what courage looked like. Mr. Brennan had retreated to the kitchen, but everyone could see him through the service window. His face still pale, his movements jerky. He'd bark orders at the cook, then fall silent when he remembered the audience watching his every move. "You got family, Jean?" Axel asked, nursing a cup of black coffee Meredith had brought him. The question landed like a stone in still water. Jean stared into his soup. "Had a wife, Sarah. She passed 8 years ago, cancer." He paused. "We never had kids. Always said we would, but the war. When I came back, I wasn't ready. By the time I was, we'd waited too long. Brothers? Sisters. Sister died young. Brother moved to Alaska in the 70s. Haven't heard from him in 20 years. Jean managed a weak smile. "Just me now?" Axel nodded slowly, a knowing look in his eyes. "You know what they say about family. You don't always get to choose the one you're born into, but you can build the one you need." Before Jean could respond, a younger biker approached the table. He couldn't have been more than 30, with bright green eyes and a nervous energy that suggested he wasn't used to being still. His vest showed fewer patches than Axel's, marking him as newer to the club. "Axel, the guys want to know, how long are we staying?" Axel didn't even look up from his coffee. "As long as it takes, Jax. As long as what takes? As long as it takes for our brother here to finish his meal in peace. For every person in this town to understand what happened tonight. And for that coward in the kitchen to understand he doesn't get to treat veterans like garbage." Axel's tone was casual, but steel ran underneath. "We clear?" Jax grinned. "Crystal. I'll spread the word." He glanced at Jean, gave a respectful nod and walked away. Jean set down his spoon, his appetite fading under the weight of what was happening. "You don't have to do this. I don't want to be a burden." "A burden?" Axel leaned back, his expression somewhere between amused and offended. "Brother, you carried your burden when you were 19 years old, slogging through jungle, fighting a war for people who didn't appreciate it. You carried your burden when you came home broken and got spit on instead of thanked. You carried your burden for 60 years while this country forgot about you." He leaned forward, eyes intense. "Tonight? Tonight you let someone else carry it for a while." The words hit Jean harder than any insult Brennan had thrown. His throat tightened, and he had to look away, blinking rapidly. When was the last time someone had acknowledged his pain instead of adding to it? Through the window, Jean could see townsfolk gathering on the sidewalk across the street. Word had spread fast. In a town like Riverside Bluff, nothing stayed secret for long. Some people looked scared, clutching their phones like lifelines. Others looked curious. A few looked angry, as if the bikers had invaded their peaceful town like an occupying force. But Jean also saw something else. An old man in a Vietnam veteran's cap stood at the edge of the crowd, his hand raised in a slow salute. A middle-aged woman held a sign hastily scrawled on cardboard, "Thank you for your service." 2 teenage boys sat on their bikes, watching with wide eyes, as if witnessing something they'd only seen in movies. "They're going to talk about this," Jean said quietly. "The whole town. Some of them won't understand. Let them talk." Axel's voice carried no concern. "We ride through a lot of towns, Jean. Some love us, some fear us, some want us gone before we've even stopped our engines. But we don't ride for their approval. We ride for each other. And tonight, we're riding for you." From across the room, the woman biker with silver-streaked hair approached. Up close, Jean could see she was older than he'd thought, probably in her late 50s, with a face that had seen weather and hardship, but remained beautiful in a fierce, uncompromising way. "I'm Charlotte," she said, her voice surprisingly soft. "I wanted to introduce myself properly." Jean started to stand, but she waved him down. "Stay seated, honey. You've stood enough for one lifetime." She pulled a chair from a nearby table and sat at the end of the booth. "My daddy was a Marine, served in Korea, came home to West Virginia and spent the next 40 years working in coal mines because nobody would hire a man with a limp and nightmares." Her eyes glistened. "He died at 62, lungs full of coal dust, never complaining once. Every time I see a veteran treated like you were tonight, I see my daddy. And I'll be damned if I let it slide." Jean didn't know what to say. The soup sat cooling in front of him, but his appetite had been replaced by something else, a warmth spreading through his chest that had nothing to do with the food. "There's a lot of us out here with stories like that," Charlotte continued. "Warriors who came home to nothing, parents who sacrificed everything and got forgotten, brothers and sisters who fell through the cracks." She reached across the table and squeezed Jean's hand. "You're not alone anymore. You hear me? You're not alone." The dam broke. Jean's shoulders shook as tears he'd held for decades finally spilled over. He tried to speak, to thank her, to explain that he didn't deserve this kindness, but the words wouldn't come. All he could do was hold onto Charlotte's hand like a lifeline, while Axel sat quietly across from him, giving him the space to break without judgment. Meredith appeared with a box of tissues, setting them on the table with a gentle smile before disappearing again. Around the bistro, the bikers maintained their vigil, some sitting, some standing, all waiting with the kind of patience that spoke of men and women who understood that healing couldn't be rushed. Outside, the crowd across the street had grown. Jean could see Sheriff Morrison's patrol car pulling up, lights flashing but no siren. The sheriff, a heavy-set man in his 50s, who Jean recognized from the grocery store, got out slowly, surveying the scene with the careful assessment of someone trying to decide if this was a problem or not. Axel noticed too. "That's going to be interesting," he muttered. Jean wiped his eyes with a tissue, trying to compose himself. "I don't want trouble with the law." "There won't be any trouble," Axel assured him. "We're just citizens enjoying a meal at a public establishment. Last I checked, that wasn't illegal." The door opened, and Sheriff Morrison stepped inside. His hand rested on his belt, not on his weapon, but close enough to make a point. His eyes swept the room, counting heads, assessing threats, looking for anything that would justify action. "Evening, folks," he said, his voice carrying the practiced calm of someone who'd broken up bar fights and domestic disputes for 20 years. "Got a call about a disturbance. Everything all right in here?" Axel stood, moving with the same deliberate calm he'd shown since the beginning. "Evening, Sheriff. No disturbance. Just making sure a veteran gets treated with the respect he's earned." Morrison's eyes found Jean, still sitting in the booth with red-rimmed eyes and a half-eaten bowl of soup. Recognition flickered across the sheriff's face. He'd probably seen Jean around town, another invisible old man trying to survive on scraps. Sheriff Morrison took a few steps deeper into the bistro, his boots echoing on the worn linoleum. His hand had moved away from his belt now, his posture relaxing by a fraction. "Mr. Caldwell, that you?" Jean nodded, surprised the sheriff knew his name. "Yes, sir. You all right? Nobody hurt you or anything?" "No, sir." "These folks," Jean's voice caught, "these folks have been nothing but kind to me." Morrison's eyebrows rose slightly. He turned back to Axel, reassessing. "That right?" "That's right," Axel confirmed. "Though I can't say the same about the owner of this establishment." The sheriff's jaw tightened. He'd known Brennan for years. They'd gone to high school together, in fact. Brennan had always been the type to cut corners, to look down on anyone he perceived as beneath him. Morrison had taken more than a few complaints about the way Brennan treated certain customers, but nothing had ever been serious enough to warrant action. Until now. "Where is Brennan?" Morrison asked. As if summoned, the restaurant owner emerged from the kitchen, his earlier arrogance replaced by nervous energy. "Sheriff, thank God you're here. These people have been harassing me, intimidating my customers." "That's a lie." Meredith's voice cut through the room, surprising everyone, including herself. She stood near the counter, her hands clenched into fists. "Mr. Brennan, you know that's a lie." Brennan's face reddened. "You work for me, Meredith. I'd be careful what you... What? She took a step forward, her fear dissolving into anger. What I say? You going to fire me for telling the truth? Because I've kept my mouth shut for 2 years, watching you treat people like garbage. But not tonight. Not about this. The sheriff held up a hand. Everybody calm down. Meredith, what happened here? She took a breath, steadying herself. Mr. Caldwell came in for soup and coffee. He was polite. He had money to pay. He wasn't causing any trouble. Mr. Brennan took one look at him and decided he didn't belong here. Called him a beggar. Told him to go to a shelter. Humiliated him in front of everyone. Morrison's expression darkened. That true, Brennan? I was just... The man looked like he couldn't pay. He showed you his money, Meredith interrupted. He showed you and you still threw him out. The sheriff turned to Jean. Mr. Caldwell, you want to press charges? Public humiliation, discrimination. We could make a case. Jean shook his head slowly. The thought of lawyers, courtrooms, official statements, it was all too much. I just want to finish my soup in peace, Sheriff. Morrison nodded, respect flickering in his eyes. Fair enough. He turned to Brennan. You and I are going to have a conversation about how you run this place. But that can wait. He looked at Axel. How long are you folks planning to stay? As long as it takes for Mr. Caldwell to finish his meal and feel safe walking out of here with his head held high. Axel replied evenly. The sheriff studied him for a long moment, then nodded. All right, but I'm going to ask you to keep things peaceful. No property damage, no threats, no escalation. Can you do that? We're not here for trouble, Sheriff. We're here for him. Axel gestured to Jean. A man who wore the uniform deserves better than what he got tonight. Morrison's eyes moved to Jean's Marine Corps cap, and something in his expression softened. My grandfather was a Marine. Iwo Jima. He walked over to Jean's booth, extending his hand. Thank you for your service, Mr. Caldwell. And I'm sorry this happened in my town. Jean shook his hand, overwhelmed by the gesture. Thank you, Sheriff. Morrison straightened, addressing the room. All right, folks. As far as I can see, no laws are being broken here. Everyone's got a right to eat at a public restaurant, and everyone's got a right to stand up for what's decent. His gaze landed on Brennan. We clear? Brennan nodded stiffly, his humiliation complete. The sheriff tipped his hat to Jean and walked out, pausing only to disperse the crowd that had gathered outside. Through the window, Jean watched him gesture for people to move along, his presence authoritative but not aggressive. As the patrol car pulled away, the tension in the bistro eased another notch. Some of the bikers who'd been standing moved to sit down. Charlotte ordered coffee and pie for the whole group, much to Meredith's delight. The tip from this would probably cover her rent. Jean picked up his spoon again, the soup now lukewarm but still comforting. Axel had returned to the seat across from him, scrolling through his phone with practiced ease, a reminder that these weren't just rough men on motorcycles, but people with lives, families, responsibilities. You got somewhere to stay tonight, Jean? Axel asked without looking up from his phone. Got an apartment above the laundromat on 5th Street. It's not much, but it's home, Axel nodded. We're camped out at the Pines Motel on the edge of town. We do an annual ride through Oregon this time of year, raise money for veteran charities, visit VA hospitals, that sort of thing. We'll be here another day or two before we head south. Jean's chest tightened. Another day or two. Then these people who'd stood up for him, who'd made him feel human again, would disappear like smoke. He'd be alone again, back to invisible. As if reading his thoughts, Charlotte appeared beside the booth. Before you start thinking we're going to vanish and forget about you, let me stop you right there. She pulled out a business card and set it in front of Jean. That's got my number, Axel's number, and the number for our chapter house. You need anything, and I mean anything, you call. Ride to the VA? Someone to help fix things around your apartment. Just want to talk? You call. Jean stared at the card, his vision blurring again. I don't understand. Why are you doing this for me? Jax, the younger biker, appeared carrying his own cup of coffee. He slid into the booth next to Jean without asking, his energy more subdued now. You want the real answer? Jean nodded. Because most of us have been where you are. Maybe not exactly the same, but close enough. Jack stared into his coffee. I came back from Afghanistan 7 years ago. 23 years old, missing part of my left leg below the knee. Nightmares that wouldn't quit. My family didn't know what to do with me. My girlfriend left. I couldn't hold a job because I'd snap at people or zone out in the middle of shifts. He looked up, meeting Jean's eyes. I was living in my car, planning to drive it off a bridge, when Axel found me at a rest stop. Didn't know me from Adam, but he saw the veteran plates, saw me sleeping in the back seat, and he knocked on my window. Bought me breakfast, let me talk for 3 hours straight, then offered me a place to crash until I figured things out. Jax gestured around the room. Half the people in this room have similar stories. Charlotte's husband came home from Desert Storm and drank himself to death because he couldn't get help. That guy over there, he pointed to a biker with long grey hair pulled back in a ponytail, spent 5 years homeless after Vietnam before the club found him. We look after our own, Jean, and you're one of ours whether you signed up for it or not. Jean's hands trembled as he picked up Charlotte's card, tracing the embossed logo with his thumb. I've been alone for so long I forgot what it felt like to have someone care. Well, get used to it, Charlotte said firmly. Because we're not going anywhere. Even after we leave Riverside Bluff, you've got family now. You understand? Jean nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. Across the restaurant, Brennan emerged from the kitchen again, this time carrying a fresh bowl of soup and a thick slice of apple pie. He approached Jean's table with visible reluctance, setting both down without making eye contact. The soup got cold, he muttered. And the pie. Consider it an apology. Jean stared at the food, then at Brennan. The owner still wouldn't meet his eyes, but the gesture, however grudging, was something. Thank you, Jean said quietly. Brennan nodded once and retreated quickly. Disappearing back into his kitchen sanctuary, Axel smirked. Baby steps, the night wore on. Jean finished his fresh soup and the pie. The best apple pie he'd had in years, sweet and tart with a flaky crust that melted on his tongue. Around him, the bikers swapped stories, their voices a low rumble of camaraderie. Some were funny, tales of mechanical failures in the middle of nowhere, of getting lost on back roads, of practical jokes played on new members. Others were serious, memories of brothers who'd passed, of battles fought and survived, of the long road to healing. Jean listened, sometimes contributing a story of his own, more often just absorbing the warmth of being included. For the first time in decades, he wasn't on the outside looking in. He was part of something. By the time Jean finally stood to leave, it was nearly midnight. His legs felt stiff from sitting so long, but his spirit felt lighter than it had in years. Axel walked beside him toward the door, Charlotte and Jax following close behind. The other bikers had already started filtering out, their engines rumbling to life in the parking lot like a chorus of thunder. Meredith caught Jean at the door, pressing a folded piece of paper into his hand. "My phone number," she said quietly. "If you ever need anything or if you just want to talk." "I mean it." Jean pocketed the paper, his eyes stinging again. "You're a good person, Meredith. Don't let anyone tell you different." She hugged him quickly, fiercely, then stepped back with tears in her eyes. "Thank you for your service, Mr. Caldwell." Outside, the cool October air hit Jean's face, refreshing after the warmth of the bistro. The parking lot was filled with motorcycles, rows upon rows of gleaming chrome and steel, each one a testament to freedom and brotherhood. The bikers stood beside their machines, some adjusting helmets, others checking equipment, all waiting for him. Axel gestured to a pickup truck parked at the edge of the lot, a well-maintained Ford with the Hells Angels logo discreetly placed on the tailgate. "Charlotte's going to give you a ride home. We'll escort you. You don't have to—" "Jean," Axel's voice was patient but firm. "Let us do this. For us as much as for you." Jean nodded, too overwhelmed to argue. Charlotte opened the passenger door for him, helping him up into the seat with a gentleness that belied her tough exterior. She climbed into the driver's side and started the engine. What happened next was something Jean would remember for the rest of his life. One by one, the motorcycles started, their engines creating a symphony of power. Then they began to move, forming two lines, one on each side of Charlotte's truck. As she pulled out of the parking lot, the bikers fell into formation, escorting Jean home like he was a dignitary, a hero, someone who mattered. People came out of their houses to watch. Curtains parted. Porch lights flickered on. The rumble of 100 motorcycles rolling through Riverside Bluff at midnight was impossible to ignore. Some faces showed fear, others curiosity, but Jean saw something else too: respect, awe, the recognition that something significant was happening. Charlotte drove slowly, letting the procession maintain its formation. She glanced over at Jean, a small smile on her lips. "How you doing over there?" "I don't have words for what I'm feeling right now," Jean admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "Then don't try to find them. Just feel it." The procession turned onto 5th Street, and Jean directed Charlotte to the small apartment building above the laundromat. It looked even more run down in the harsh glare of streetlights, peeling paint, a sagging porch, windows that didn't quite seal properly. Jean had always been ashamed of it, but tonight, with 100 bikers escorting him home, it felt like a palace. Charlotte pulled up to the curb and the motorcycles spread out, filling the street. Engines died one by one, until silence settled over the neighborhood. Axel dismounted and walked to Jean's door, opening it and offering his hand. Jean took it, stepping down with as much dignity as his old body would allow. His cane steadied him as he stood on the sidewalk, looking at the sea of faces watching him. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Axel pulled something from his vest pocket, a small patch about 3 inches across. It bore the winged skull of the Hells Angels, but beneath it were words Jean had to squint to read in the dim light. Veteran, brother, protected. "This isn't a membership patch," Axel explained. "You're not a Hells Angel unless you earn it through years of commitment. But this," he pressed it into Jean's palm, "this is a promise. You're under our protection. Anyone messes with you, they mess with all of us. And if you ever need anything at all, you show this patch, and help will come." Jean stared at the patch, his vision blurring. "I don't know what I did to deserve this. You served when your country called. You survived when others didn't. You kept going when it would have been easier to quit." Axel's hand gripped Jean's shoulder. "That's more than most people will ever do. You've earned more than a patch, brother. You've earned peace." Charlotte appeared beside them, holding a grocery bag. "We took up a collection while you were finishing your pie. There's enough in here for a week's worth of groceries, maybe more if you shop smart. And before you say no," she cut off Jean's protest before it could form, "this is what family does. We take care of each other." Jack stepped forward next, holding a business card. "There's a VA clinic about 40 miles south of here. I called ahead. They've got an opening next Tuesday at 10 a.m. for a full checkup. I wrote the address on the back. Charlotte will pick you up at 9. Jean's legs felt weak. He gripped his cane harder, trying to process the avalanche of kindness. "I can't. This is too much. It's not enough," a voice said from the crowd. An older biker with silver hair and a weathered face stepped forward. "I'm Marcus. Army 1971 to 1973. I came home to nothing. Slept in parks, ate from dumpsters, thought about ending it more times than I can count." His eyes were fierce. "If someone had done for me what we're doing for you, I might have gotten my life together 20 years sooner. So take it, brother. Take it and don't look back." Around him, heads nodded. Stories just like Jean's, just like Marcus's, lived in the hearts of nearly everyone present. They'd all been broken in different ways, all found salvation in the brotherhood of the road, all understood what it meant to be forgotten by a grateful nation. Jean's composure finally shattered completely. He stood on the sidewalk, an 81-year-old man who'd been carrying weight for 6 decades, and he wept. Not quietly, not with dignity, but with great heaving sobs that shook his entire frame. Charlotte wrapped her arms around him, letting him cry into her shoulder while Axel kept a steady hand on his back. The bikers stood in respectful silence, giving him space to release what needed to be released. A few had tears in their own eyes. They understood. God, did they understand? When Jean finally pulled himself together, his face was red and his eyes were swollen, but something had shifted. The weight he'd carried, shame, loneliness, the crushing burden of invisibility, had lessened. "Not gone, but lighter. Thank you," he whispered, his voice raw. "Thank you all," Axel smiled. "Get some rest, Jean. We'll check on you tomorrow." Charlotte handed him the grocery bag and gave him one last hug. "You've got my number." "Use it," Jean nodded, clutching the bag and the patch like lifelines. He turned toward his building, then paused and looked back. 100 faces looked back at him, men and women of all ages, all backgrounds, united by leather and loyalty and the understanding that some bonds transcend blood. He raised his hand in a salute, not the crisp military salute of his youth, but something slower, more meaningful. A gesture of respect, of gratitude, of recognition that he'd found something he'd thought lost forever. The bikers returned it, 100 hands rising in unison. Then, one by one, the engines roared back to life. The motorcycles pulled away in formation, their taillights disappearing into the night like red fireflies. The rumble faded gradually, leaving only the quiet sounds of a sleeping town. Jean stood on the sidewalk long after they'd gone, the patch warm in his hand, the grocery bag heavy with promise. For the first time in decades, he wasn't afraid of tomorrow. For the first time in decades, he had something to look forward to. He climbed the stairs to his apartment slowly, each step an effort, but no longer a burden. Inside, he set the grocery bag on his small kitchen table and unpacked it with trembling hands. Bread, eggs, milk, coffee, canned soup, fresh vegetables, a package of chicken, even a small cake with "Welcome Home." Brother written in blue icing. Jean sat at the table, staring at the bounty before him, and laughed. A real laugh, not bitter or hollow, but genuine and full. When was the last time he'd laughed like that? He couldn't remember. That night, Jean slept better than he had in years, the Hell's Angels patch carefully placed on his nightstand where he could see it first thing in the morning. And when he did wake, reaching instinctively for the proof that last night hadn't been a dream, it was still there, real, tangible, undeniable evidence that he mattered. The next morning, Jean woke to sunlight streaming through his apartment window, a rare occurrence since he usually kept the curtains drawn. But today felt different. Today, he wanted to see the world. He made breakfast with food from the grocery bag Charlotte had given him, scrambled eggs, toast with real butter, fresh coffee that didn't come from the discount bin at the corner store. As he ate, he kept glancing at the Hell's Angels patch on the table beside him, still half convinced it would disappear. It didn't. Around 10 o'clock, there was a knock at his door. Jean's first instinct was fear. Had Brennan sent someone? Had the town turned against him? But when he opened the door, he found Jack standing there with 2 large boxes. "Morning, Jean," the young biker said with a grin. "Brought you some things." "Can I come in?" Jean stepped aside, and Jax carried the boxes into the small living room. "What's all this?" "Winter's coming," Jax explained, opening the first box. "Axel figured you might need some warmer clothes." He pulled out a heavy jacket, not new, but clean and well-maintained, with a wool lining that looked like it could withstand an Oregon winter. There were also flannel shirts, thick socks, a knit cap, and gloves. The second box contained food, more groceries, plus a small space heater. "Your landlord ever fix that radiator?" Jax asked, nodding toward the ancient heating unit in the corner that Jean had mentioned the night before. "Not in the 3 years I've lived here," Jean admitted. "Figured as much. This should help." Jax plugged in the space heater, testing it. Warm air began flowing immediately. "There, that'll keep you from freezing." Jean sank into his worn armchair, overwhelmed. "You didn't have to do all this." "Yeah, we did." Jax sat on the edge of the couch. "Look, Jean, I know what it's like to feel like you're drowning and everyone's just walking past, watching you go under. When Axel pulled me out of that car 7 years ago, he didn't just save my life, he gave me a reason to keep living. Let us do the same for you." Before Jean could respond, there was another knock. This time it was Charlotte, carrying a toolbox. "Heard you got a leaky faucet and a door that doesn't close right. Point me in the right direction." For the next 2 hours, Jean's apartment became a hub of activity. Charlotte fixed the bathroom faucet that had been dripping for months, tightened the hinges on the front door, and even replaced 2 burned-out light bulbs Jean hadn't been able to reach. Jax went through the apartment making a list of other repairs needed, promising to come back with more help. Around noon, Axel arrived with lunch. Sandwiches from a deli across town, nothing fancy but made with care. They sat around Jean's small kitchen table, eating and talking. Jean found himself sharing stories he hadn't told anyone in years, about Sarah, about the war, about the jobs he'd lost, and the dreams that had died. They listened without judgment, without pity, with only understanding. "You should come to the motel tonight," Axel said as they finished eating. "We're having a cookout. Nothing fancy, just burgers and stories around a fire. You'd be welcome." Jean hesitated. The thought of being around so many people, of being the center of attention, still made him nervous. But something in Axel's eyes, an unspoken promise that he'd be safe, that he'd belong, made him nod. "Okay, I'll come." That evening, Charlotte picked him up at 6. The Pines Motel sat on the outskirts of Riverside Bluff, a collection of small cabins surrounding a central courtyard. Motorcycles lined the parking lot, and in the courtyard, a large fire pit blazed with warmth and light. Jean stepped out of the truck, gripping his cane, and immediately felt dozens of eyes turned toward him. But instead of judgment or pity, he saw smiles, waves. A few bikers called out greetings, welcoming him like an old friend. Marcus, the silver-haired veteran from the night before, approached with a plate piled high with food. "Hope you're hungry. We've got enough to feed an army," seemed appropriate. Jean took the plate, his stomach rumbling in response to the smell of grilled burgers and roasted vegetables. He found a seat near the fire, and within moments people had gathered around him. Not crowding, just including. Stories flowed like the beer that was passed around. War stories, road stories, stories of hardship and redemption. A woman named Diana talked about losing her son in Iraq and how the club had given her purpose when grief threatened to destroy her. A man called Ironhead described his battle with addiction and how his brothers had literally carried him to rehab and visited every single week until he was clean. Jean listened, contributed when he felt moved to, and slowly began to understand what he'd found. This wasn't just a motorcycle club. This was a tribe of survivors, people who'd been broken by life and had found strength in each other. Around 9 o'clock, Axel stood and called for everyone's attention. The conversations quieted, all eyes turning to the leader. "Most of you know what happened last night," Axel began. Some small-town restaurant owner thought he could disrespect a Marine veteran, thought he could throw an 81-year-old man out like trash. His voice grew harder. He was wrong. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. But tonight isn't about that coward. Tonight is about welcoming a new brother into our family. Axel gestured to Jean. Gene Caldwell served 2 tours in Vietnam. He came home to a country that didn't appreciate his sacrifice. He spent 60 years carrying weight that should have been shared. Well, starting now, he doesn't carry it alone. The bikers erupted in cheers and applause. Gene felt his face flush, his eyes burning with familiar tears. But this time, he didn't try to hide them. Axel walked over and handed Gene something, a leather vest, similar to the ones the bikers wore, but without the official Hells Angels patches. "This doesn't make you a member," Axel explained. "That's earned through years of riding and proving yourself. But this makes you family. You wear this, and every Hells Angel in the country will know you're protected. You're one of ours." Gene took the vest with shaking hands. The leather was soft, well-worn, and on the back someone had carefully stitched a Marine Corps emblem and the words, "Eugene Caldwell, USMC, Brother Forever." He couldn't speak. He could only pull the vest on, feeling it settle onto his shoulders like armor, like a promise, like home. Charlotte appeared beside him, adjusting the fit. "Looks good on you, Gene." "I don't deserve this," he whispered. "Yes," she said firmly, "you do. You just forgot for a while. We're here to remind you." The party continued late into the night. Jean stayed longer than he'd planned, soaking in the warmth and camaraderie. When Charlotte finally drove him home around midnight, he was exhausted, but in the best possible way. The exhaustion that comes from laughter and belonging rather than loneliness and despair. As they pulled up to his apartment, Charlotte turned to him. "Tuesday morning, 9 o'clock. I'll be here to take you to that VA appointment. Don't even think about saying no." Jean smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes. "I wouldn't dream of it." He climbed the stairs to his apartment slowly, the leather vest warm against his body, the patch heavy in his pocket. Inside, he hung the vest carefully on a hook near the door, where he could see it every morning. For the first time in decades, Jean went to bed not dreading tomorrow, but looking forward to it. He had a doctor's appointment. He had people who cared. He had a family. The weight he'd carried for 60 years hadn't disappeared entirely. Trauma and loneliness don't vanish overnight. But it was lighter now, distributed across 100 shoulders instead of borne alone. Jean fell asleep with a smile on his face, dreaming not of jungles and gunfire, but of motorcycles rumbling down open roads, of brothers standing beside him, of finally coming home after a 6-decade journey through darkness. Tomorrow, Riverside Bluff would wake to find that something had shifted. A veteran who'd been invisible for years was now protected by 100 warriors. A restaurant owner who'd thought himself untouchable had learned that cruelty had consequences, and a community was being forced to reckon with how it treated its most vulnerable. But tonight, Gene Caldwell, Marine survivor brother, simply slept in peace. The following week transformed Gene's life in ways he couldn't have imagined. True to her word, Charlotte picked him up Tuesday morning at 9 sharp. The VA appointment revealed what Gene had suspected but never addressed: severe arthritis in his knee, high blood pressure, and the lingering effects of Agent Orange exposure. But for the first time, he had a care plan, medication he could afford through VA benefits he hadn't known he qualified for, and a follow-up appointment already scheduled. Jax returned with 3 other bikers on Wednesday, and together they spent the day making repairs to Gene's apartment that his landlord had ignored for years. They fixed the radiator, patched holes in the walls, replaced the ancient toilet that had been running constantly, and even painted the kitchen. Gene tried to help, but they insisted he supervise from his armchair, regaling them with stories from his Marine days. By Friday, word had spread through Riverside Bluff. The story had morphed and grown. Some versions were exaggerated, others simplified, but the core remained. A veteran had been disrespected, and 100 bikers had come to his defense. The town was divided in its reaction. Some residents stopped Gene on the street to shake his hand, to thank him for his service, to apologize that it had taken outsiders to remind them of basic decency. Mrs. Patterson from the library brought him a box of books, saying she'd noticed he liked military history. The owner of the hardware store refused to let him pay for a new lock for his front door, but others whispered that he'd brought trouble to their quiet town, that the bikers were dangerous, that Gene was making himself out to be more important than he was. Gene heard the whispers, but found he didn't care as much as he once would have. The opinions of people who'd ignored him for years held less weight than the actions of those who'd stood beside him. On Saturday morning, exactly 1 week after the incident at the Oakwood Bistro, Gene made a decision. He put on his new jacket, pinned the Hells Angels protection patch to his Marine Corps cap, and walked downtown. His destination was deliberate, his steps more confident than they'd been in years: the Oakwood Bistro. He pushed through the door just after 10 a.m., the breakfast rush in full swing. Conversations didn't stop this time. People had gotten used to seeing him around town, had heard the stories, had formed their own opinions. But heads turned, watching to see what would happen. Meredith was working the counter. Her face lit up when she saw him. "Mr. Caldwell, your usual booth?" "Please," Gene said, his voice steady. He settled into the same booth where, 1 week ago, he'd been humiliated and thrown out. But everything felt different now. He wasn't the same man who'd slunk in, hoping to go unnoticed. He was Eugene Caldwell, United States Marine Corps, brother to 100 warriors, and he belonged here as much as anyone. Meredith brought coffee without being asked, along with a warm smile. "Breakfast special, okay? Eggs, bacon, toast? That would be perfect, thank you." As she walked away, movement caught Jean's eye. Mr. Brennan had emerged from the kitchen, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, the two men simply looked at each other across the dining room. Then Brennan did something Jean never expected. He walked over, pulled out the chair across from Jean, and sat down. "Mr. Caldwell," he began, his voice lacking its usual arrogance, "I owe you more than the apology I gave last week. That was forced." "This one isn't." Jean said nothing, waiting. Brennan rubbed his face, looking older than his years. "I've spent the past week thinking about what I did, about who I've become. My father was a veteran, Korea. He died when I was 12, and I spent my whole life trying to prove I was tougher than he was, more successful, more something." He laughed bitterly. "Turns out I just became cruel. Why are you telling me this?" Jean asked quietly. "Because you deserved better. Because every veteran who walks through that door deserves better. Because I've been running this place for 15 years, and somewhere along the way, I forgot that feeding people isn't just about profit. It's about community, about taking care of each other." Brennan met Jean's eyes directly. "I'm sorry. Truly sorry. Not because 100 bikers scared me, but because what I did was wrong." Jean studied the man across from him. He could see the sincerity in Brennan's eyes, the weight of genuine remorse. Part of him wanted to hold on to the anger, to make Brennan suffer the way he'd suffered. But Jean had carried enough weight in his life. He didn't need to carry hatred too. "Apology accepted," Jean said simply. Brennan's shoulders sagged with relief. "Thank you. And from now on, any veteran eats free on Sundays. It's not much, but it's a start." "It's more than nothing," Jean acknowledged. Brennan stood, extending his hand. Jean shook it, feeling the firmness of a genuine gesture. As the restaurant owner walked back to the kitchen, Jean noticed something. Several customers had been watching the exchange, and more than a few were nodding in approval. Meredith returned with his breakfast, setting it down with a grin. "I heard what Mr. Brennan said. About veterans eating free on Sundays. That was my idea, actually. Told him if he didn't do something meaningful, I'd quit and make sure everyone knew why." Jean chuckled. "You've got spine, young lady." "Learn from the best," she said, gesturing to his patch. As Jean ate his breakfast, savoring every bite, the door opened and a familiar rumble filled the air. Axel, Charlotte, and a handful of other bikers walked in, their presence commanding but not threatening. They'd come to check on him, Jean realized, to make sure he was okay. Axel slid into the booth across from him, the same spot Brennan had vacated. "How's the food?" "Best breakfast I've had in years," Jean said honestly. Charlotte sat beside him, squeezing his shoulder. "You doing okay?" "We can leave if this place brings back bad memories." Jean shook his head. "No bad memories. Not anymore, just new beginnings." The bikers ordered their own breakfast, and for the next hour, the Oakwood Bistro was filled with laughter and stories. Other customers relaxed, some even striking up conversations with the bikers. The fear and prejudice that had colored their first encounter was fading, replaced by curiosity and, in some cases, respect. When it came time to pay, Jean pulled out his wallet, but Meredith waved him off. "Mr. Brennan's orders. Your money's no good here on Saturdays either. Or any day, really, but don't tell him I said that." Jean insisted on leaving a generous tip, which Meredith accepted with tears in her eyes. As they prepared to leave, Brennan appeared one last time. "Mr. Caldwell, would you consider coming back? Regularly, I mean. I think this place could use a reminder of what real courage looks like." Jean looked around the bistro, at Meredith wiping down tables, at the customers who'd witnessed his humiliation and his redemption, at the bikers who'd become his family, at Brennan, who'd found the courage to change. "I'll be here every Saturday morning," Jean said. 10 o'clock sharp. "I'll have your booth ready," Brennan promised. Outside, the autumn sun broke through the clouds, warming Jean's face. The bikers would be leaving tomorrow, heading south to continue their annual ride. But Jean knew this wasn't goodbye. He had phone numbers, addresses, a family that stretched across state lines and bound by something stronger than blood. Axel pulled Jean aside as the others headed to their motorcycles. "You're going to be okay, Jean, you know that, right?" "I do now," Jean said, and he meant it. "We'll be back through this way in the spring. But if you need us before then, I know. I call." Jean tapped the patch on his cap. "Family takes care of family." Axel smiled, pulling Jean into a fierce hug. "Damn right they do." One by one, the bikers said their goodbyes. Charlotte kissed his cheek and made him promise to keep his VA appointments. Jack slipped him another business card with additional resources for veterans. Marcus gave him a challenge coin from his own service, saying, "Pass it on when you find someone who needs it more than you do." As the motorcycles roared to life and pulled away in formation, Jean stood on the sidewalk waving until they disappeared from view. The rumble faded, replaced by the normal sounds of a small town going about its Saturday. But nothing was normal anymore. Not for Jean, not for Riverside Bluff, not for anyone who'd witnessed what happened when compassion met cruelty and refused to back down. Jean walked home slowly, his cane steady, his head high. People he passed nodded in greeting. A young boy in a military family shirt saluted him, and Jean saluted back, his heart swelling. That night he sat in his apartment, now warm, repaired, filled with food and kindness, and wrote letters. One to the Hells Angels chapter, thanking them. One to the VA, praising the care he'd received. One to Meredith, encouraging her to pursue the nursing degree she'd mentioned wanting, and one to himself, a reminder he placed on his refrigerator. "You are not invisible. You are not a burden. You are a Marine, a brother, a survivor. You matter." The weeks that followed brought more changes. Jean started attending a veterans support group at the community center. He volunteered at the library, reading to children and sharing history. He became a regular fixture at the Oakwood Bistro, his Saturday morning presence a reminder to everyone of the power of standing up for what's right. The Hells Angels kept their promise. Cards arrived in the mail, birthday wishes, holiday greetings, random check-ins. Charlotte called every Sunday. Jack sent photos from the road. When Jean's refrigerator finally died in December, a new one appeared on his doorstep with a note, "Family doesn't let family freeze their food." Jean Caldwell lived another 7 years, each one richer than the last. He never became wealthy. His apartment never became a mansion. His body never stopped aching, but he was never alone again. When he passed peacefully in his sleep at 88, his funeral was attended by over 200 people. Half of them wore leather vests. The other half were townspeople who'd learned, through Jean's example, what it meant to see the invisible, to honor the forgotten, to stand up when standing up mattered. And on his gravestone, beneath his name and service dates, were words chosen by Axel and carved with love: Marine, brother, never forgotten. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.